You can support In the Past Lane with as little as $1 a month. Just go to the support page at our website, inthepastlane.com. Thanks. In the spring of 1935, a group of anti-Nazi activists climbed aboard a huge German ocean liner. The ship, the SS Bremen, was docked in New York Harbor, and it sported several large Nazi flags with the menacing swastika in the center. The activists cut down the flags, ripped them into pieces, and cast them into the harbor. The incident made international headlines and prompted a demand from Hitler that the United States arrest and punish the perpetrators. But U.S. officials refused, citing the fact that the swastika flag was not the official flag of Germany, which was true. Months later, Hitler announced the Nuremberg Laws that stripped German Jews of citizenship and civil rights. The laws also included a declaration, inspired in part by the incident in New York Harbor, that the Nazi flag with its swastika was now indeed the official flag of the German state. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 84, in which we discuss how America's system of legalized racial oppression, or what we call Jim Crow laws, inspired and informed officials in Nazi Germany in their quest to create a racially pure German state. We are coming to you this week from the Henry Ford Studios, located in central Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Guiding us along, as always, is our fearless executive producer, Lulu Spencer. So what's happening in the Past Lane this week? Well, people, I'm back from Iceland. And let me just offer the following. Wow! Iceland is simply one of the most amazing places on the planet. My wife and I were on the National Geographic Explorer with about 150 other passengers. Over the course of 10 incredible days, we circumnavigated Iceland, making 8 landings, half of them in Zodiac rubber boats. We hit remote islands, saw incredible wildlife, including, of course, lots of puffins and whales. We hiked through mountains to see massive, dazzling waterfalls, took a boat ride among icebergs, saw Europe's largest glacier, and hiked up a volcano. It was just amazing. And if you can get to Iceland, I highly recommend doing more than just a few days layover in Reykjavik. There's so much more to see, and it will blow your mind. And if you can afford it, the National Geographic trip is worth every penny. I should point out, especially since I'm always asking you to support the podcast through Patreon or PayPal, that the only way my wife and I could go on this trip was for free. I was a speaker on board, so it was an all-expense-paid situation. We were incredibly lucky. Okay, I better stop here. I could go on all day about Iceland. If you want to see my photos and my videos, you can find them all on Instagram. Just look for In the Past Lane. A couple quick announcements. This week there won't be any pit stop. I just have too much catching up to do since I took that fantastic vacation. Also, please subscribe to the podcast at Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, check out our merchandise at inthepastlane.com. We got a ton of t-shirts and mugs and all kinds of cool stuff. And if you buy something, a little bit of the proceeds go to supporting the podcast. So thanks. All right, time to get to this week's main feature, my interview with James Whitman about his recently published book, Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. Okay, people, your journey in the Past Lane begins now. One aspect of the civil rights movement that has always impressed me is how many liberation movements around the world have been inspired by it. I remember the first time that I watched a documentary on the efforts of Catholics in Northern Ireland in the late 1960s to gain full civil rights and equality, and hearing people singing, "We Shall Overcome." At first I thought it was an awkward soundtrack choice, but then I realized the Irish marchers were singing it. Similar scenes have played out all around the world. But, as this week's episode makes clear, the fact is that the very system American civil rights activists were struggling to dismantle, that is, Jim Crow white supremacy, also inspired and informed regimes around the world, including Nazi Germany. Well, to tell us more about this dark but important chapter in American history, I'm joined by James Q. Whitman. He is the Ford Foundation Professor of Comparative and Foreign Law at Yale Law School. His books include Harsh Justice, The Origins of Reasonable Doubt, and The Verdict of Battle. He's here today to speak to us about his latest book, Hitler's American Model, The United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. James Q. Whitman, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thank you for having me.
Well, your book begins by looking at a key meeting on June 5th, 1934, in which Nazi lawyers gather to basically plan what become the Nuremberg Laws. And these are the laws that are enacted in 1935 that reduce Jews to second-class citizenship and bar marriage and interracial sex between Jews and Germans, among other things. And this is kind of a key turning point in the rise of the Nazi regime. But before we delve into that, why don't we take a step backward to sketch out the background history of the few decades leading up to it. So in the United States, the system of Jim Crow, a white supremacist legal order, has been firmly put in place over the decades leading up to the 1930s. And another aspect of American racial law has also taken hold, which is immigration restriction, most notably 1924 and the National Origins Act of that year. And in Germany in 1934, Hitler has been in power about 18 months, and he and the Nazis are busy creating the Nazi state. And in so doing, they're looking for examples of how they might do this. And one example, of course, is the United States. And so I'll just ask, since your book is titled Hitler's American Model, what is it that these Nazis, and including Hitler, that they saw, what did they see in America that was admirable and serving as a potential model for their new Nazi order?
Well, they saw things they couldn't find anywhere else. They did a lot of research and the hunt for inspiration, parallels, examples on which they could draw. But at the end of the day, it was really the U.S. that offered what they regarded as the most useful material, to quote a term that the Minister of Justice used at that meeting you've already described. What they found in the U.S. was in part a system of second-class citizenship. There was, in practical reality, a form of second-class citizenship for African Americans who were effectively denied the right to vote, especially in the South, and many other privileges of meaningful citizenship. There also were formal juridical forms of second-class citizenship that applied especially to Filipinos and Puerto Ricans down into the 1920s. That is, people who'd been conquered in the war against Spain in 1898. All of that was of interest, but the thing that really seemed to the Nazis most important for their projects, the American precedent, the American model, really had to do with the criminalization of interracial marriage. 30 American states out of the 48 had anti-miscegenation statutes, that is, statutes forbidding interracial marriage, not just between whites and blacks, by the way. These also targeted Asians, for example, and Native Americans. And many of these statutes included something that the most radical Nazis really wanted to introduce in Germany, which was criminalization of interracial marriage.
Yeah, and what's at the basis of this? You note that one of the things that they share, Nazis look at America and they, as you say, they've researched it and they've spoken to a lot of Americans, and many of them have actually studied in America. And they've taken to heart one of the key ideas of white supremacy in the U.S. at the time, which is that at any given moment, African Americans are going to take over the country, that there's this ever-present threat of a black takeover. And that fits perfectly with the vision of Nazis when they look at their Jewish population in Germany, and seeing that any moment Jews are going to take over. How does that parallel work out?
I mean, it's a piece of absolute insanity. It's absolutely right. When the Nazis spoke of the Jews in Germany, they often spoke of the danger of Jewish influence, exactly as you say, of a Jewish takeover. That was nonsense, of course, in the German context. But to say the same thing about American blacks was more than nonsense. It was lunacy. But that is indeed how they spoke about the American situation. They described American blacks as an alien race trying to get the upper hand, and described Jim Crow legislation as involving necessary measures of self-defense in order to prevent this alien race from triumphing. When we think of Nazi madness, this really ought to rank very high on the list of things that characterize a truly lunatic political movement.
They seem to be shopping around for various parts of American history and American policy to kind of use in a particular way. It doesn't bear up under logical scrutiny, but it certainly can be wedged into a system of thought as ways to justify this emerging order. And so one of the things that seems very apparent in your research is that one thing from a legalistic standpoint that they really admire is the fact that American law seems to be so innovative and creative when it comes to, there's no other country in the world that has crafted these kinds of racial laws with such specificity as the United States has. And that seems to be an intriguing or attractive aspect to these Nazi lawmakers.
That's exactly right. And, there's a terrible irony to that because, of course, we were then and remain now proud of American innovativeness. One of the things that inspires all of us Americans, or at least American lawyers, when we talk about U.S. law, is our ability to create new inventive forms of law, things that fostered, for example, the biotech industry in the U.S., things that couldn't be done elsewhere in the world because they couldn't create the right forms of contracts for it. We did it in America. Same is true of American corporate law, which is imitated all over the world. But unfortunately, when it comes to something as extraordinarily ugly as white supremacist legislation, we discover exactly the same pattern in the early 20th century. As I say, the Nazis hunted all over the world for examples, but it was the U.S. that was creating the really novel, exciting, new statutory forms of discrimination, as we call it now. This was worse than discrimination, really. But it wasn't just a matter of the statutes. It was also a matter of the way the courts conducted themselves. It was very, very difficult for Nazi lawyers to figure out how to create a racist regime, because creating a racist regime involves throwing out, of the kind they wanted to create, involves throwing out so many of the basic principles of law. Things like the presumption of innocence. They faced a tremendously difficult problem in defining who counted as a Jew. Basic principles of German law insisted that you couldn't have a criminalization without clear definitions. But there was no possible clear definition of a Jew. And one of the things that the Nazi lawyers, or the radical ones anyway, found admirable about American law was its sheerly improvisatory character. Judges would just make seat-of-the-pants decisions about who counted as a black when litigants appeared before them. That was something the radical Nazis wanted for Germany as well.
Right. They saw that Americans seemed to be willing to create law to justify the order that they wanted to either build up or maintain, that politics or that law would be used to uphold the racial order that they wanted to impose.
That's exactly right.
And another thing, you're very careful in your book to point out that it's not as though the Nazis had no ideas about how to do this and that the Americans essentially gave them the playbook. The Nazis were perfectly capable of creating their terrible racist regime and carrying out the crimes that were associated with it without American inspiration. But there's something about finding models and finding examples to turn to that sort of lend legitimacy in some ways to, or at least in the minds of many Nazi lawmakers, that this seems to be important to them to find global precedents around the world. Is that part of the story as well?
Yeah, I think that is part of the story. Now, to begin with the first thing that you said, we do have to be careful not to tell false causal stories that somehow the Nazism was the fault of the U.S. or that, there never would have been Nazism if there hadn't been an American model on which to draw. That's just silly. That would be the wrong way to present this material, and I hope nobody reads my book that way. At the same time, exactly as you say, it is true that it matters to people who are involved in what they think of as a great historic revolution in human affairs, that they should be able to say, look, the winds of history have been blowing in our direction somehow. They didn't think, by the way, that they were simply borrowing from the U.S., and they weren't simply borrowing from the U.S. They thought the U.S. had, as Hitler said in Mein Kampf, taken the first tentative steps. And in that sense, the model was offered only the beginnings of what they wanted to do. And they would not have said themselves that they were simply importing American ways of doing things into Europe. Their, in some ways, characteristically German view was that they were going to take what the Americans had done and do it in a much more rigorous and ruthless way. The Americans themselves just weren't capable, in their eyes, of achieving what Nazi Germany was capable of achieving when it came to creating a race regime.
Right. There were some glaring mistakes that they saw in how Americans carried it out, not the least of which is that American race law largely ignored Jews. And for some of the Nazis involved in creating their laws, they saw this was a major flaw.
That's absolutely true. And in addition, of course, it has to be said, there were many aspects of American law and American life that were unambiguously liberal and democratic that involved things that they didn't want for Nazi Germany at all. some of the time when they talk about the U.S., they just seem a little bit puzzled about how such a racist, white supremacist country could still be hanging on to all of the liberal values that Americans talked about.
Right. They seemed able to pick up, though, ultimately on the fact that there were these ideals and things like the 14th Amendment, and then there was the reality on the ground, and that America had effectively, even though it had these ideals, had effectively imposed a racial and legal order that really defied those things.
And they were right about that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so that at the end of the day, or by the 1930s, when the Nazis are drawing up their own state, they see that African Americans essentially are non-citizens in terms of the law. They've been stripped of pretty much all their civil and social political rights, the right to vote, the right to go to serve on a jury, and all of those other things. And so that in some ways, some of these ideals enshrined in American law and in the Constitution really don't matter on the ground. And that's the Nazis are going to take that idea and run with it.
Right. And let's not forget, it's not just that American blacks were deprived of the privileges of citizenship. There was also open season on them through lynching.
That's right. When there's another parallel there where violence, when all else fails, violence is the thing that sort of holds, that really fastens the new order into place. And you see that violence against African Americans has been declining, at least in its most explicit form of lynching by the 1930s, but it's on the rise in Germany in terms of crowd violence and vigilante violence and eventually state violence against Jewish citizens.
Right, although there it's important to emphasize another striking aspect of this story, which is that the Nazis actually deplored American lynching. There were, of course, exactly as you say, lynchings going on all over Germany after Hitler took power. But the view of the Nazis was that persecution should be done by the state,
right,
and not by private parties. This is one of the things that really most strikingly sets the Nazi approach, let's call it, apart from what you see in Jim Crow America.
And there are other aspects. I mean, they view America in very interesting ways. Of some of the most revealing things to me as an American historian, some of this history in terms of learning about the ways in which Germans understood America was really fascinating. I was known for a long, long time that Hitler had praised the United States in Mein Kampf rather explicitly, particularly for its racial laws. But also there's the way that many German thinkers in the 1930s see the United States in terms of world history. There are a couple of sources you cite where the authors basically say that the founding of the United States, that the founding period in the late 18th century, that's the first key moment in the global movement for white supremacy worldwide. And that was pretty striking. And it wasn't just a single source. It seems to have been everywhere. Could you tell us a little bit more about that kind of global understanding of a white supremacist project and where they see the U.S. as sort of being a key piece in that history?
Yeah, I mean, the Nazis saw the United States, and I guess you could say they saw the United States and the founding in particular in much the way that modern, contemporary left-wing critics of what some call white settler democracy see the history of the United States. I mean, the U.S. from a very, very early date, it was a naturalization statute of 1790 that restricted immigration to the United States to free white persons.
Yeah, so it's right there from the beginning.
It's right there from the beginning. The Nazis quoted that. They knew about it. And what they saw in American history, beginning with the founding, was what a lot of Americans saw at the time, that is, the conquest of a great continent by, as the Nazis put it, Nordic white settlers, particularly English, German, Scandinavian. They saw, of course, that this Nordic domination in the U.S. had been under threat by immigration, especially from Eastern Europe or from Asia. But when they looked at American immigration legislation, they saw a healthy, happy effort to reclaim the Nordic character of this, great settler land empire. They did indeed trace it back to the founding. And of course, I'm not the historian who says it, others do, but as they embarked on their own conquests to the east, they often invoked the American conquest of the West.
Yeah, that was probably the most striking, that Germans' admiration for essentially manifest destiny, right down to, I think Hitler at one point in the 1920s, in one of his speeches, compares Jews to Indians and puts them in the same sort of light as Americans did, as Indians as sort of an obstacle that needs to be, or a problem that needs to be dealt with in order to achieve national greatness.
Yeah, I think that the quote is from 1928. He says, the Americans gunned down the millions of redskins to a few 100,000 and have them locked up in cages now.
Right.
And he says, Europeans better do exactly the same thing if we're going to be able to compete with the U.S.
There's another key figure in this story, which is Heinrich Krieger. And he's a very important, he's actually one of these few characters who studies law in the United States in 1933 and 1934 at the University of Arkansas. And it makes his specialty American race law. That's what he studies, not just how it pertains to African Americans, but also, as you know, to Indians, Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, and others. And he writes this very influential book, Race Law in the United States, published in 1936. And you point out that two of his heroes are Jefferson and Lincoln, which is really quite remarkable. I think our listeners would be very interested to know what it is that Heinrich Krieger saw in Jefferson and Lincoln that was so admirable.
It's remarkable and awful. To explain, I have to emphasize something about Nazi history in the early 1930s. The Holocaust was not yet part of the Nazi program. The Nazis were in no political position to engage in mass extermination. That was not what they wanted to do. I mean, they may have wanted to do it. No doubt Hitler would have been happy to set up extermination camps in 1933, but it couldn't be done. The initial aim of Nazi policy was forced emigration. That was the point of the Nuremberg Laws in particular, was to make life so intolerable in Germany that the Jews would just flee.
Yeah.
It's in that respect that Krieger in particular talks about Jefferson and Lincoln, because both of them were in favor of resettling African Americans somewhere else.
Right.
Both of them believed firmly that the two, as Jefferson I think put it, that the two populations, even if both free, could never coexist in the same country. Lincoln, down to 1863, I think, was requesting that Congress provide funds for resettlement in Central America. But all of that, these are our great heroes in the U.S., but from the point of view of a Nazi like Krieger, it seemed that both Jefferson and Lincoln wanted to do exactly what the Nazis wanted to do. And Krieger goes so far as to say that if Lincoln had not been assassinated, the Nazi program would have been instituted in the U.S., as the Nazi program looked as of the year 1936.
Yeah. It's truly cringeworthy, as you point out. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, the sources that you used. It's always a key point of fascination for historians, but it seems to be the key source for you is the one that you start the book with, which is, in good German fashion, they have kept incredible records, including a word-for-word transcript of this meeting in June of 1934 of top lawyers and legal minds in Germany to craft what become the Nuremberg Laws. And one of the things that seems that your goal in the book is to challenge what seems to be a dominant view among historians and legal scholars, which is that Nazi Germany really wasn't all that inspired by American legal practice and so forth. And your book really says, yes, it was. I mean, not that it borrowed, entirely from the U.S., but it was definitely inspired, definitely influenced. And so tell us about this source and some of the other key sources that you found that were key to your being able to make this important claim.
Well, so that source, which is, as you say, a stunning word-for-word transcript of a day-long meeting, which shows that these Nazi lawyers, and doctors, by the way, there were also doctors there, studied American law. The meeting begins when the Minister of Justice presents a memo on American law. There's a list of 30 states with their anti-miscegenation statutes that circulated. There's discussion of American law throughout. It's impossible to read this transcript without recognizing the truth of the attraction of the American model for not all Nazis, I should say, by the way, because the meeting also shows that there was quite a conflict between radical Nazis, the most vicious of them, who wanted to introduce American models, and more moderate Nazis who were opposed to using the American models. That's quite a remarkable discovery when you read the transcript. The transcript was actually published in 1989, but not in a standard source book that most German historians use, although it has been to some extent used by historians of Nazism. It's published in a standard set of volumes of preparatory materials for German criminal law reform that begins in the 19th century and continues up to the present. The transcript, the way they operated was that there was the stenographic transcript, that is the word-for-word summary, word-for-word transcription that you mentioned before. The participants afterwards were invited to edit it down. So there's a shorter version edited down, and there's the longer version. Mm-hmm. In the process of editing it down, they tried just to give the meat, cut some of the meat off the bones. I don't know what the right metaphor is, but a lot of the material about America, not all of it, but a lot of the material about America was cut. It was edited down to about a third or a quarter of its original length. So you have to go back and read the full transcript to find out what went on in the meeting. I think there are a couple of reasons why people haven't made what could have been made of this source, of this really devastating source. One reason is that they tend to read the short version of the transcript.
Right.
It's very, very, very long, the full transcript. It's a full-day meeting, and you have to sit patiently and read through it. I think there's another very important reason, too. The natural audience, for the scholars who would naturally work with this are, of course, Germans. You have to spend a lot of time with the German language. You have to know German law, because there's a lot of technical legal discussion. But for German scholars, it's really unacceptable to say things that might seem in any way to deny Nazi responsibility for Nazi crimes. I mean, completely understandably. You don't want to go into print saying, well, but look, they were looking at these other countries. So, although there's, one German dissertation that looked at this transcript and some of the other sources that I use too and said, gee, they regarded America as the classic example. Even that dissertation writer buried this somewhere in a couple pages somewhere in the long book version of his dissertation. And other people just don't want to talk about it. There's another, very excellent standard German book that just says, and they discuss possible foreign models and then rushes on and doesn't really go into what it is they were saying.
Right.
And I think in some ways that's the main reason this material hasn't been used, because it's just too uncomfortable for Germans to talk about these things.
Right. It's the weight of German history has sort of literally obscured the history itself because it's just too difficult.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And the insistence that people should just bear the weight.
Yeah.
And of course, I want to say, I'm not for a moment denying German responsibility. I think my family lost 11 relatives in the camps or something like that. I'm not, But it's easier for an American to say, hey, wait, look what's here. Right.
To see it as a much larger issue than just simply this rogue regime seems to spring out of nowhere. It's actually connected to ideas and systems in the Atlantic world, to be certain.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else in this? I mean, we've talked about this 1934 meeting and so forth and how this all plays out, eventually takes full form in the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. Is that really the key way in which we see American influence, or does that American influence carry on and show up in other aspects of the Nazi regime heading into World War II?
Yeah, I mean, it's pervasive.
Yeah.
So there are some other important sources. There are Nazi lawyers spent a great deal of time discussing the U.S. in 33, 34, 35. I was able to collect quite a large volume of literature. There's one other particularly important source which is connected to the June 1934 meeting. In 1933, September, so, Hitler came to power in January, the radical Nazis put together a kind of a pamphlet describing what Nazi reforms in criminal law should look like. This is called the Prussian Memorandum.
Right.
And the Prussian Memorandum went out of its way to invoke U.S. law. They said, look, we're not the first country to do this, and then they talk about Jim Crow. Although very strikingly, they think that American Jim Crow goes too far.
Yeah, that's also an interesting fact, in particular regarding, if I remember correctly, the one-drop rule, among other things. And also, the impracticality of segregation is another point.
Well, I mean, they clearly took a real interest in segregation, and there were a couple of different views which we can reconstruct about how segregation on the American model might be brought into Germany. So for some of them, introducing segregation fit into the radical Nazi program, and they were eager to do it. That's true of the Prussian Memorandum, although what the Prussian Memorandum says is that U.S. segregation actually applies in private as well as public settings, will only apply it in public settings, they said. There were also more hesitant, moderate Nazis who wanted segregation as an alternative to criminalization. The radical Nazis wanted to criminalize. In the end, the Nuremberg Laws don't include segregation. There were measures like segregation later on in the 30s, but that was not the drive in this early period in the 30s. Instead, they devoted themselves to what you began by describing, second-class citizenship and criminalization of interracial sex and marriage. But what is true of segregation is also what is true of the one-drop rule. They looked at U.S. segregation, as I said, and thought it went too far, and the same was especially true when it came to how the American states defined who counted as African American. There in particular, the Nazis, it's astonishing to see this stuff, deplored the one-drop rule. This is the rule found in some jurisdictions, not all in the U.S., that held that anybody with one drop of black blood counted as black. The Nazi literature described this as involving too much human hardness. They said, you can't do that to people.
That is an astonishing remark.
Isn't it, though?
Yeah, considering the source.
And the Nazi definition of who counted as a Jew, that none of the definitions were as radical as anything found in any of the American states. American law was much harsher in that respect.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there were tremendous similarities, but also some important distinctions. Well, one thing that I, by way of sort of heading towards a conclusion here, is one thing I always ask my interviewees is, how does what you've written matter now? And in your case, it's quite interesting. I read somewhere that you finished your manuscript and submitted it the day before the 2016 presidential election.
Yep.
Not fully knowing just how relevant is suddenly going to be with Charlottesville and other incidents kind of suddenly making many Americans aware of the fact that Nazis are not the thing of the past. There's a reborn Nazi ideology and Nazi party and similar groups, whether you call them the alt-right or the white nationalists, and that suddenly all this stuff really, really matters. So what's your take on that and where we are now and what we can take away from looking back to the 1930s?
Yeah, I certainly did not want to write such a timely book. But obviously what the book shows is some of the depth. I mean, in a sense, we all knew that, of course, about Jim Crow, but it shows not only how deep the strain of white supremacy runs in the U.S., but how much the U.S. historically has been a leader in white supremacist movements. Actually, very shortly after I published the book, I don't know how they discovered it, but I was contacted by U.S. neo-Nazis who were excited by it. I was like, it's the last thing that I want.
Yikes.
From this book, they wanted to know what I contribute to their site.
Thankfully, they were open about who they were. I could see somebody,
Oh, no, I had to figure out who they were.
Oh, okay, yeah, because you could easily, just think it was some sort of organization. Say, sure, I'll write a 600-word.
No, I learned that lesson, Ed. I mean, when you write a book like this, you really have to do a little bit of background check before you respond to people.
Yeah. I will say that whenever I've been carrying this book around for the last week, and in every coffee shop and in every public setting where I'm holding it or carrying it, somebody stops me and asks me about it.
Oh, really?
It's amazing. I was just in a coffee shop yesterday, and in the course of an hour, 3 different people asked me about the book because it was sitting right there on the counter. So there's something arresting about the cover and the title.
Well, I'm just the messenger.
That's right. But what do you make of this resurgence in white nationalism and the clear evidence that among a certain subset of Americans, there is this fascination with and reverence for the Nazi regime and the kind of white supremacist, white purity that it stood for?
I don't know what to say except that I find it extraordinarily dispiriting. I wish that all of the, you can call it Nazi white supremacy as well, that all of this white supremacy of the early 20th century had simply been, as I thought it was when I was young, completely discredited. But it hasn't been discredited, not in the U.S. and not in Europe either. And as I say, that's hard to accept, but it's clearly true.
Clearly true, and I guess a good example of why knowing more than just a certain superficial level of history is really, really important to being a fully effective citizen.
I certainly believe that.
Well, James Whitman, this has been a great conversation, and your book is, as you said, in some ways accidentally super timely, but it is a chilling read in many ways, but also really illuminating at the same time. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us at In the Past Lane.
Oh, thank you. It was a great pleasure.
James Q. Whitman is the author of Hitler's American Model, The United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law, published by Princeton University Press. Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. For more information about the many things we talked about today, head over to our show page for this episode at inthepastlane.com. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, it's Shark Week. What's the plan?
Obviously, root for the sharks.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.